Hi everyone, I'm going to go over how I drew Billie Eilish in colored pencils, and I'm going to go over some of the challenges that I faced in this piece. So the first thing I did was I started with the eyes, which is usually what I start out with, and I started with a dark pencil, which was black, and I put in her pupils and her upper eyelid area where the eyelashes will be, and then I went back to my lightest colors and started building layers upon those lighter colors. And I'm doing this for a number of reasons. One is so that if I make a mistake, I can still erase and fix it. Also, this helps with blending since I'll be layering these colors. And three, when doing this, I'm also reserving the texture of the paper, which is what is going to allow us to layer the colors in the first place. For the nose, I mainly focused on shading and values. So when sketching out the nose, the sketch itself is very minimal. So in this case, I sketched out the bridge of the nose and where the nostril is going to be. And then the rest of the nose is built through shading and values, which are your lights and darks or your highlights and shadows. So the wing of the nose seemed to be darker and had more shadow to it, whereas the tip of the nose was much lighter and was what I would consider my highlight. The rest I used the basic mid-tone colors I would be using for the majority of the face. And for the face, I'm mostly using the Faber Castell Polychromos pencils, which aren't really known to blend as well as your wax-based pencils such as Prismacolor or Luminance. So I'm being very light-handed, and you may notice at times that I'm holding the pencil far back almost to the end of the pencil and being very gentle at first. So the main colors I use for a face is Bister and Light Flesh, and these two colors I often use for fair skin tones as a base. Another go-to color I use is Venetian Red for any darker red colors such as blush or anything like that. I also use Ivory for a yellowish tint, and I do use a pencil from the Prismacolor set, which is a grade lavender, and that is for any light purplish colors I see within the skin. Other colors I may use are grays, whether that be cold or warm grays depending on the tint I'm looking for. A cold gray will have a cooler tone to it. It may look more blue, and a warm gray is, of course, your warmer tones, which have more of a brownish tint to it. And I will use the whole range depending on how dark I need to go. I also use darker browns like Walnut or Van Dyke lightly to darken the Bister if I need to go with a darker brown. For the lips, I used the same pinks I used for her face, but added some pink matter like to brighten up the color. And to make her lips look three-dimensional, I focused on the shadows and highlights. The shadows were very dark where the lips meet, and there's a lot of highlights on her lower lip. The shadows were very dark where the lips meet, and there were a lot of highlights on her lower lip. So I made sure to reserve those areas by coloring around where the highlights will be. You can even add white to help reserve that area as well. Once I get the rest of her lips dark enough, I eventually go over the highlights with soft pink because the highlights aren't purely white. So I decided the shadow on the right side of her cheek looked a little too brown, and in the picture it looked more purple to me, so I decided to use the Indanthrone Blue and the Venetian Red. The reason I decided to go with these two colors was because I was using the Indanthrone Blue as my blue color for other areas of the face for shadow, mainly by the hairline by her eye, and the Venetian Red is the color I'm using for most of her face, and so using those two colors together will not only give me purple, but I figured it would be more realistic since the shadows are usually a cooler color like blue, and it would be casting over her cheek, and her cheek was more red, where I would use the Venetian Red. For the hair, I started with my darkest color, which was dark sepia, and I focused on the shadows and I added strokes in the direction of the hair. I did this first so that I had a sense of the flow of her hair, and adding the shadows will make the process easier as I added more colors, especially since her hair is blonde. So I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to approach the small strands of hair by her ear, and I knew it would be a challenge when I picked the picture. I almost didn't do this picture of Billie Eilish because of this, and I decided it would be a good challenge for me to tackle head on and hopefully overcome. So I went back and forth whether I should color in the entire face and then go in with my electric eraser to draw the small strands of hair. But I thought better of it and decided to reserve the areas and go back and forth between the skin tones and the hair. So I'm just adding more shadows to the hair, darkening certain areas by going over it, adding more layers with my dark sepia, and adding more hair-like strokes in the direction of the hair. While doing this, I'm focusing on just a section or two of hair, and once I think it's dark enough, I'll go in with my lighter colors. For this, I use some of the Caran Luminance pencils because they have more neutral light brown tones that are perfect for blonde hair that I don't have with my Faber Castell Polychromos set. So I invested some money on just a handful of these Luminance pencils for colors I don't have in my Polychromos set. So I use the brown ochre 10% and 50% as well as raw umber 10% and 50%. The raw umber 50% is really good for shadows in the blonde hair, as you'll see later. So her bangs are rather light and wispy across her forehead, so I did the same thing I did for the strands by her ear, and I reserved that area figuring I would go back and forth between the hair and the skin tones. Again, I'm not sure if it was the best approach, and there might be an easier way to do this, but I learned best by trial and error. And I also thought that this would allow me to focus more on those areas. So I ended up coloring the entire area with Titanium Buff from the Luminance set, which is the lightest cream color I have, and I colored it in with this color as a base. I then went back to the strands by her ear and began coloring in between those strands with my skin tone colors, which was mostly the Venetian Red and the Indanthrone Blue for the purple color, and then I went in with my electric eraser to add more strands and flyaways. For the ear, I used a lot of the same colors that I used for the skin. So I started out with the colors Light Flesh and Bister, and then I paid really close attention to my reference photo for the other colors. But I really found that I used a lot of the same colors except for the top of the ear, which seemed to have an orangish tone to it, so I added burnt ochre for that area. But overall, I just focused mostly on shadows, highlights, and midtones. The shadows and darkest areas being located mostly on the inner ear and anywhere the skin meets. I really focused on where the light hits the ear since there are a lot of curves and parts that pop out and sink in to determine how light or dark to go in each area. Then I smoothed it all out with a white luminance pencil to blend all the colors, and I repeated the process of layering all my colors again to darken it overall. And for the shadowed areas within the ear, I didn't use straight black. Instead, I laid down the color Payne's Gray, and I used the black as a darkening tool to darken the Payne's Gray color further. I then went back to working on the hair by her ear, trying to darken up the area around the small strands and adding more layers to the shadowed areas to darken them further. I then continue working down her neck using the same colors, once again starting off with Light Flesh and Bister as my base. I then go back to focusing on her bangs. So it might seem like I'm jumping around a lot, but I'm actually working on the same area for quite a while before moving on to the next. I've noticed some color pencil artists seem to stick to one area until it's completely finished, but I really like to work on a piece as a whole so I can judge my values, hues, and tones as I build up the layers as I compare it to other parts of the piece. But for video and learning purposes, I'm really trying not to jump around too much. As for the bangs, I'm just doing the same thing I did with the small strands of hair by her ear, only this area is going to be lighter. So as I worked on the hair, I noticed that there was this very dark shadow right behind her ear where I could make out a shape that I could just color in. This area is so dark that I can't really make anything out, so I just colored it in with dark sepia. This is also true with the shadow under her ponytail, though I colored in that shape with Payne's Gray because it looked more blue. As for the rest of the hair, I'm working on one section at a time using dark sepia to add in the hair-like strokes in the direction of the hair, and you'll notice that I'm not making full connecting lines from one end of the section to the other. If you make too many long lines going from one section of the hair to the other end of the section, the hair tends to look either stringy or very stiff like straw. So to avoid this, I'm using flowing lines from one end and then going to the other end of that section and adding flowing lines from that end to the middle. And I'm also looking for other shapes that I might be able to just color in. So after I get all the shadows in with my dark sepia, I start adding in my lighter colors like Brown Ochre 10% from the Luminance set, as well as Raw Umber 10% and Raw Umber 50% for any darker blonde areas. And as I work my way down, I'm using the same techniques I did for the other sections of the hair I just worked on. Only this time there's a lot more shadow, so I'm using a lot of dark sepia and even some black if necessary to darken the sepia while making sure I'm working in the direction of the hair and looking for any shapes I can color in. And for the lighter areas, I work the same technique of adding lines in the direction of the hair. For the neck, I used the skin tone colors that I used for her face, but I added some cold grays, like Cold Gray 5, to darken the neck, as much of it was in shadow. And I added shadow where the hair meets the neck and the shoulders. After that, I began to fine-tune the neck, the shoulders, and the hair, and once everything is dark enough, I'll go back to the hair and start adding the flyaways. So for the flyaways, I use my electric eraser over the hair as well as a very sharp white luminance pencil. The flyaways are a nice touch in making the hair look even more realistic. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or suggestions, let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, please give it a like, it really helps. And if you want to see more, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.